They say his screams echoed down the cobbled alleys of Smithfield for hours, sharp, guttural wails that didn't sound human. By the end, his lungs were too torn to even cry. The year was 1305. The man was William Wallace, and what happened to him wasn't just execution. It was a spectacle of slow, deliberate destruction designed to annihilate the spirit of a people. This is not just Wallace's story. It is the story of countless souls who faced humanity's darkest impulses and somehow, in their suffering, illuminated our path toward justice. William Wallace had defied the English crown not with diplomacy or gold, but with a sword raised high and a cry for freedom. He fought in Scotland's forests, hills, and marshes, wherever English boots dared step. To the Scots, he was a hero. To King Edward I, he was a virus that needed eradication. The capture came through betrayal. Near Glasgow in August 1305, John de Menteith, a fellow Scotsman, sold Wallace to his enemies. No English sword could subdue the rebel knight, but treachery worked perfectly. They bound him in iron and marched him hundreds of miles to London, parading him like a captured beast. In the Tower of London's dank corridors, Wallace waited. Some say he prayed, others that he maintained defiant silence. What is certain is that Edward I wanted more than just his death. Longshanks wanted a message written in blood, one that would burn itself into the memory of all who witnessed it. Wallace's punishment would be hanged, drawn, and quartered. But first, they would strip away his dignity. On execution day, they dragged him naked through London streets, tied to a horse by his ankles. By the time they reached Smithfield, his skin was raw from stones and filth. Thousands had gathered not to witness justice, but vengeance. The hangman's noose tightened, but Wallace would not be allowed to die, not yet. Cut down just before unconsciousness, he faced the blade, the slicing, the opening of his belly while he still breathed. Even as they pulled out his organs and burned them before his dying eyes, witnesses said he never begged. His final defiance became legend, a spark that would ignite Scotland's freedom centuries later. Medieval torture was not random cruelty. It was systematic psychological warfare. The instruments of pain were carefully engineered tools designed to break bodies and spirits with scientific precision. The most infamous device consisted of a wooden frame with rollers at each end. Victims' wrists and ankles were bound, then slowly pulled apart as executioners turned the handles. Joints dislocated, muscles tore, bones cracked, all while the victim remained conscious. The rack's true horror lay not just in physical agony, but in its deliberate pace. Hours could pass as the body was gradually destroyed, each turn of the wheel bringing fresh waves of unbearable pain. Though historians debate its widespread use, the Iron Maiden became torture's most terrifying symbol. This coffin-shaped device lined with spikes was designed to impale without killing immediately. Victims experienced prolonged agony as metal points pierced flesh and muscle, ensuring death came slowly. Even if rarely used, its reputation alone was enough to break resistance. The Catherine wheel combined execution with spectacle. Victims were tied to large wooden wheels while executioners systematically shattered their limbs with iron cudgels. The broken body was then woven through the spokes and displayed publicly, a grotesque warning that reinforced authority through terror. But the true power of these devices lay not in their use, but in their presence. The sight of a rack in a courtroom or the knowledge of an Iron Maiden in the dungeon below created an atmosphere of absolute terror. fear became the state's most effective weapon. The church, meant to offer sanctuary and salvation, became one of history's most efficient machines of torture. In hidden chambers beneath abbeys and monasteries, the Inquisition perfected the art of purifying souls through pain. Brother Thomas descended the stone steps reluctantly, carrying only a candle and his growing doubts. The chamber below was a contradiction. Holy symbols adorned walls lined with instruments of agony. Here, sin was not forgiven, but wrung out, drop by drop, with heaven's supposed blessing. The woman they brought was a midwife accused of heresy. Her crime was healing without the church's permission. As the prior slowly turned the rack's wheel, stretching her body beyond natural limits, he whispered prayers. "This is not punishment," he said. "This is mercy. We stretch the pride from her bones so the soul can bow to God." But when Thomas looked into her eyes, he saw not demons but desperate humanity. Her final words haunted him. "You believe in him, don't you? So do I. That's why I cannot lie when I say he is not with you down here." That night, Thomas tore pages from the Liber Purgationis, the book of sanctioned tortures, and fed them to the flames. With a rusted nail he carved into the wooden rack frame, "God does not dwell where screams are caged." He left the abbey the next morning, never to return, but his message remained, a crack in the foundation of institutionalized cruelty. Behind every device, every public spectacle, lie the testimonies of those who endured unimaginable pain. Their voices, often lost to history, reveal the true cost of humanity's capacity for cruelty. Anne Askew, 1521 to 1546, refused to recant her Protestant beliefs, even as the rack tore her body apart during Henry VIII's reign. Unable to walk to her execution, she was carried to the stake in a chair, yet still found strength to encourage fellow prisoners. Her courage inspired religious reformers for generations. The witch trials across Europe produced thousands of testimonies extracted under torture. Anna Göldi, one of the last witches executed in Switzerland, confessed only after enduring the threat of the breaking wheel. Her story exposed how torture was weaponized against marginalized women, often based on superstition and social tensions. Inquisition records from Spain contain hundreds of testimonies describing the constant sound of dripping water, muffled screams, and the psychological warfare of anticipation. One victim wrote, "The waiting was worse than the pain, knowing that each dawn might bring fresh horrors." These survivors' accounts reveal that torture's deepest wounds were often psychological. Physical scars healed, but the trauma of betraying loved ones under duress, of confessing to crimes never committed, haunted victims for life. Medieval courts transformed justice into performance art, where predetermined verdicts were dressed in legal pageantry. Trials became stages for displaying power rather than seeking truth. The accused, already broken by torture or fear, faced judges who were loyal servants of the crown or church. Evidence extracted under duress was presented a divine revelation. Confessions born of desperation were held up as proof of guilt. Joan of Arc's trial exemplified this judicial theater. The teenage peasant who had led French armies was subjected to months of interrogation designed not to determine guilt, but to break her spirit. When she briefly recanted, under pressure, they used her moment of weakness to justify her execution. Her death became a rallying cry for French independence and, centuries later, led to her canonization as a saint. The spectacle extended beyond courtrooms. Public executions were designed as community events, complete with vendors, entertainers, and cheering crowds. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who defy authority. Yet even in these darkest moments, flickers of resistance appeared. Some refused to confess, standing firm until death. Their defiance challenged the system's legitimacy and inspired others to question state-sanctioned cruelty. Torture was never merely about extracting information. It was a sophisticated tool of psychological control that operated on multiple levels of society. Fear as currency. Rulers understood that the threat of torture was often more effective than its application. The knowledge that racks and wheels waited in castle dungeons kept populations compliant. Fear became the invisible chain that bound subjects more effectively than any physical restraint. Dehumanization process. Torture transformed victims into symbols rather than individuals. They became heretics, traitors, or witches, labels that justified any cruelty. This psychological distance allowed otherwise moral people to participate in or witness systematic brutality. Collective trauma. Entire communities lived under torture's shadow. The public nature of executions created shared trauma that shaped behavior for generations. Parents warned children, neighbors reported neighbors, and society learned to police itself through internalized fear. The torturer's paradox. Those who inflicted pain often struggled with their role. Some became zealots, convinced of their righteousness. Others grew numb, performing cruelty as routine work. Many developed elaborate justifications, saving souls, protecting society, serving God or king, to reconcile their actions with their conscience. Modern psychology recognizes these patterns in every authoritarian system. The methods change, but the fundamental goal remains: breaking human will through pain and fear. The very extremity of historical torture ultimately sowed the seeds of its own destruction. As accounts of cruelty spread, they sparked intellectual and moral revolutions that would reshape civilization. Enlightenment ugningaum. Philosophers like Cesare Beccaria and Voltaire condemned torture as barbaric and ineffective. Beccaria's On Crimes and Punishments, 1764, argued that torture produced false confessions and corrupted justice itself. These ideas spread across Europe, challenging the foundations of authoritarian rule. Legal evolution. Slowly, painfully, legal systems began to change. The presumption of innocence, the right to legal representation, and prohibitions against cruel punishment emerged from the ashes of torture's victims. Each reform was a monument to those who had suffered. Religious reform. Within Christianity, reform movements began questioning whether a loving God could sanction systematic cruelty. The contradiction between torture and Christian teachings created theological crises that contributed to religious wars and eventual reform. Cultural shift. Artists, writers, and musicians began depicting torture's horrors, creating cultural pressure against institutional cruelty. Public opinion, once entertained by executions, gradually turned toward revulsion. The abolition of medieval torture was not the end of the story. It was a chapter in humanity's ongoing struggle against cruelty. The 20th and 21st centuries brought new forms of systematic abuse, proving that the capacity for torture evolves with technology and ideology. Psychological torture. Modern understanding recognizes that minds can be broken as effectively as bodies. Solitary confinement, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation cause trauma that often outlasts physical wounds. State terrorism. Authoritarian regimes perfected torture as a tool of political control. From Nazi concentration camps to Soviet gulags, from Chilean military prisons to modern enhanced interrogation techniques, the basic patterns remain unchanged. Digital age threats. Cyberbullying, online harassment, and digital surveillance create new forms of psychological torture. The medieval pillory finds its modern equivalent in viral shaming and digital mob justice. Legal progress. International law now recognizes torture as a crime against humanity. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, and the UN Convention Against Torture, 1984, represent humanity's collective promise. Never again. Ongoing vigilance. Human rights organizations document continued torture worldwide. Their work honors the memory of historical victims by exposing modern abuses and supporting survivors. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of torture's history is not its cruelty, but the resilience of those who endured it. In the darkest moments, human dignity found ways to survive and even triumph. Silent resistance. Many victims maintained their principles despite unbearable pressure. Their refusal to betray friends, abandon beliefs, or fabricate confessions became acts of profound courage. Spiritual transcendence. Religious prisoners often described experiences that transcended physical pain. Their faith transformed suffering into testimony, torture into martyrdom. Legacy of courage. Stories of resistance inspired liberation movements worldwide. Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, and countless others drew strength from historical examples of principled endurance. Healing communities. Survivors created support networks that preserved memory and promoted healing. Their testimonies became the foundation for truth and reconciliation processes worldwide. Educational mission. Modern torture survivors often become advocates, using their experiences to educate others and prevent future abuses. Their courage transforms personal trauma into universal lessons. As we close this journey through history's darkest corridors, we must ask, what have we learned? What do these stories of unimaginable suffering teach us about humanity? First, that cruelty is not an aberration, but a persistent temptation. Every society, every generation faces choices between compassion and control, justice and vengeance. The capacity for torture lies dormant in all human institutions, waiting for fear, hatred, or ideology to awaken it. Second, that legal and moral progress is fragile. The rights we take for granted, due process, presumption of innocence, protection from cruel punishment, were purchased with the suffering of countless victims. They must be actively defended, never taken for granted. Third, that resistance is possible even in the darkest circumstances. The human spirit possesses remarkable resilience. Even when bodies are broken, dignity can survive. Even when individuals are destroyed, their courage can inspire others. Fourth, that memory matters. By preserving the testimonies of torture's victims, we honor their suffering and arm ourselves against future cruelty. Education about historical abuses is our best defense against their repetition. Finally, that hope is not naive, but necessary. The same species capable of devising the rack and the Iron Maiden also created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The same cultures that celebrated public executions now work to abolish the death penalty worldwide. The screams that once echoed through medieval streets have not been silenced. They have been transformed into calls for justice. The chains that once bound bodies have become the bonds of human solidarity. The darkness that once seemed absolute has been pierced by the light of human compassion. William Wallace's defiant stand at Stirling Bridge inspired Scottish independence, and Askew's courage helped spark the Protestant Reformation. Brother Thomas's carved message reminded future generations that even in hell, conscience can survive. Their legacy lives on, not in the instruments of their torment, but in the institutions of justice we have built from their suffering. Every court that presumes innocence, every law that protects the accused, every treaty that prohibits torture, stands as their monument. The age of the rack and the Iron Maiden has passed, but the struggle for human dignity continues. In every decision to choose compassion over cruelty, justice over vengeance, we honor those who suffered in darkness and work to ensure that their sacrifice lights the way toward a more humane future. Their screams have become our conscience. Their courage has become our calling. Their memory has become our mission. Never forget, never again.